We are now going to listen to Vasco Fernandes. He is the Regional Procurement Manager Car Fleet at Nestlé. He is not the brother of Rodrigo. There is one single letter that is different, but their policy, their strategy is both focusing on cost efficiency. Vasco Fernandes has a mixed fleet, both of passenger cars and commercial vehicles. He has established a program in which he can generate cost efficiency across Latin America, and he is going to inspire us with his case study. Vasco, the floor is yours.
Hello, good day. My name is Vasco Fernandes, and I would like to welcome you one more time to the Fleet Latam 2021 conference. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank the organization for the invite to be present here today. So I will be your speaker for this session. And to tell you a bit more about myself, I currently hold the position of Regional Procurement Manager in AMS, or the Americas, for the car fleet category at Nestlé. I took over this role in July 2020, but I have 5+ years experience with fleets in Latam in the procurement area. So thank you for attending to this session, and I hope you enjoyed the contents that I prepared for you. So the main topic of the session today will be establishing the right KPIs for your commercial fleet in Latam. I have divided the session into 4 different sections. The introduction, where we'll cover some facts and figures about Latam and Nestlé, then move on to the fleet strategy and discuss some key concepts, framework, implementation, and highlights. Then measure the fleet performance and discuss the dimensions of fleet performance and cover some examples. And finally, a summary of the topics presented, main conclusions, and learnings of the session. So starting with the introduction and a quick snapshot on Latam. I know that most of this information won't be new to you, but just in the form of a recap. So Latin America is a vast and diverse region comprised by 4 different subregions: North America, Central America, Caribbean, and South America. This comprises 20 different countries and a population of approximately 650 million. The estimate average annual sales of vehicles is 8.1 million units in 2018 and 2019. This number went down by 25% last year due to the global pandemic, which places approximately at 6 million units sold in 2020. Approximately 1.4 million corporate leasing contracts were active in the end of 2020 in Latam. The dominant manufacturers in the region, by no other order than alphabetic, are FCA, Ford, GM, Nissan, Toyota, and Volkswagen. Local players lead the leasing markets, being the exception Mexico, where Element is the #1 leasing company there. Now, when it comes to Nestlé, Nestlé is the largest food company in the world, and it has been like that for quite a few years under a different number of measurements. Its presence spreads across 186 countries, and it has more than 270,000 employees globally. The revenue in 2020, according to the latest financial statements, was 84.3 billion Swiss francs. Our fleet globally counts at approximately 23,000 vehicles, of which 4,500 are located in Latam. Leasing is the predominant fleet ownership model. So as you can see on the map on the right, about 85% of Nestlé fleets in Latam is under leasing, whereas only 15% is still owned by the company. The largest markets like Mexico and Brazil, the leasing is definitely predominant. Some markets are still in transition, like for instance, Ecuador and Colombia, and there are other pockets where purchasing is still dominant. So you can see in the darker blue, which marks the purchase, that for Central America, Chile are still markets where purchase is dominant. Concerning then the vehicle type, 75% of the fleet are passenger cars and 25% are commercial vehicles like pickups, vans, light commercial vehicles. So before getting into the details of the subject of the presentation, I believe it's important to highlight this key concept, linked to business priorities. So clarity about the objectives and priorities of the organization at different levels and functions is key to set the right approach to your fleet. So we should be trying to answer the questions like, what are we trying to achieve? And how do we translate that into SMART objectives? And SMART is here as in the acronym for the goal setting methodology. So if you look into these boxes that I included here, like reduce fleet cost, reduce accidents, increase safety, reduce fleet idleness, improve driver experience, reduce emissions, improve cash efficiency, optimize fleet admin, just to name a few. All these boxes have great ambitions, and probably most of you have objectives somehow linked to them in your current roles. But we still lack some structure, and therefore perhaps it's a good idea to give a step back and understand how can we define a comprehensive strategy for our fleet and align the goals within the organization. And please keep in mind that fleet performance should be measured against concrete and meaningful goals. So manage for results at all times. So for all organizations, when it comes to strategy definition and implementation, there are some underlying concepts. So mission, vision, values, regulations, and policies set the foundation for how companies conduct their businesses, and therefore directly or indirectly, implicitly or explicitly, these concepts are present in your fleet strategy. So when it comes to this definition and implementation, there are two main agents in this framework. So on one hand, we have the local market, business or operating company with specific objectives, priorities, requirements, constraints, culture, and any other elements. And on the other hand, we have a centralized procurement function with a specific category strategy that can be set at different levels, global, regional, guidelines, targets like savings, specific processes and tools for fleet sourcing. So between the interaction of these two agents, and this results in a cross-function communication involving the centralized procurement and different functions at market, like that are usually linked to the fleet management, like general services, HR, finance, safety, health and environment groups. So the interaction between these two agents results in what the local approach will be. So we may start with a global or regional strategy, but we definitely end up with a local and specific approach for that particular market. Next, I would like to highlight some key items that should be part of your fleet strategy in Latam. Just some highlights, really. So the first one would be volume consolidation and centralization of the demand management. So definitely, if you haven't started or haven't completed this, this is an excellent way to optimize fleet admin and enable other efficiencies that we will see next. So next one would be simplification and harmonization of local fleet policies / selectors. So this will almost immediately result in a more efficient fleet sourcing and simplification of fleet admin activities. Because, for instance, you have to deal with a lower number of suppliers, which makes the process more efficient. The next one will be reassess funding / ownership models, meaning outright purchase versus lease, and the outsourcing of fleet services in general. So fleet financing and management is not the core business of most companies. So most of us are actually fleet customers, not fleet providers. So running this assessment will allow you to ensure a correct allocation of funds within your organization, a correct allocation of resources within the organization. The next point is actually enabled by the previous ones, okay? So scale negotiations with suppliers. This includes manufacturers, fleet management companies, and other fleet service providers. This is actually only possible if you achieve volume consolidation and centralization of demand management, if you simplify and harmonize local fleet policies and vehicle lists, and if you are using the right funding model in your fleet, then you are able to scale the negotiations and maximize the benefits that you take from them. Finally, last but not least, transition into lower emissions and/or electric vehicles. So the global trend is clear, and companies should prepare for electrification and plan for it. So make sure that you are thinking about your electrification roadmap. On this next slide, I would just like to highlight a specific point about fleet strategy definition and implementation. So identifying different clusters in your Latam fleet will definitely help you to design and implement the right strategy. And by different clusters, I mean a division by purpose and type, for instance. So I'll give you examples. We can have tool of trade vehicles in one hand, and you can have benefit cars on the other hand. Similarly, we can have passenger cars and commercial vehicles. Different clusters often require different approaches. This is an important concept, and I'll give you an example. Benefit segments typically require a wider range of vehicles to meet the preferences of employees. It is still possible to incorporate some discipline in the vehicle selection, but it's usually can't be as restrictive as in the tool of trade vehicles, where we can literally have one model per function. So in the next couple of slides, I will show you some specific items and some specific KPIs that could be used to track the performance of your fleet. I've divided those in two groups, okay? Cost and efficiency and safety and environment, for no particular reason other than the structure of the presentation itself. So when you talk about cost and efficiency, we should first understand the cost structure of our fleet. So I've included this example here, where I say that 25% of the fleet cost comes from the fuel, and the other 75% come from a combination of financing, maintenance, including tires, and management, which may include additional admin fees. So taking this structure into consideration, just as an example, what would be the relevant things to measure in your fleet performance concerning cost and efficiency? Definitely a fixed cost, because it's a larger portion of the total cost. So the funding and budgeted maintenance, for instance. Other than that, the maintenance that it's not budgeted, meaning the corrective actions. Definitely fuel, and you can track it in the form of a cost per kilometer, for instance. Also the cost related to tires that you can track in a way of kilometers driven per tire. Other variable expenses, for instance, replacement cars that you may need to use. The mileage driven, which you can then make an assessment when it comes to the efficiency of your contracts in place when you compare the contracted mileage with the actual mileage driven. And the downtime, which is definitely linked to productivity. And this is an interesting item because if you think about it, it's only relevant really for tool of trade vehicles. So for instance, commercial vehicles, because in those cases, you definitely want to increase productivity and making sure that you are taking the most of that asset. Not that relevant for benefit cars. In the next group, safety and environment, I have listed also some items. For instance, traffic violations and the different severity levels of those violations. Road accidents in terms of number of events occurred. Maintenance, and in this case, looking at maintenance from a different perspective, from a safety perspective, in terms of what are the pending actions that I have, and how can I action my drivers to correct those pending items. age of the fleet. So age of the fleet is an interesting one because it enables an indirect measurement of several other things, like maintenance cost. For instance, if I have an aged fleet, probably my maintenance cost will be higher. Also, if I have an aged fleet, probably I won't have access to the latest technologies when it comes to safety. And then we will see next, for instance, on vehicle emissions, now entering in the environmental component of this list of KPIs. Obviously, I want to make sure that I comply to the latest standards in the industry. So going back to the age fleet, if my fleet is a bit older, probably I will not be aligned with the latest standards in the industry. So age of the fleet is an interesting one. Then another one on the more on the environmental side is the actual CO2 levels that we can estimate by the averages usually communicated by the manufacturers for each particular model. Also, something else that we can track is the share of what can we consider low emission vehicles or specifically electric vehicles in the fleet. And then here on the right, I leave some just generic examples of how can you measure your average grams of CO2 per kilometer. You can make it to a certain level of data aggregation by segment. Same for the fleet age, where you can, for instance, aggregate by segment or employee grade. Also for the number of violations, where you can have for the different drivers or the different groups of drivers, like salespeople. Then finally, on the last slide, I would like to highlight some key items from our discussion, some learnings, some conclusions. So goal alignment and efficient communication across the different levels and functions are key to an effective fleet strategy. We have discussed that. Knowledge about the fleet numbers, your own fleet numbers, and the industry trends are fundamental to define the right approach and the right strategy. A successful implementation plans acknowledges specific markets, business conditions, and may comprise different approaches, as we also discussed. KPIs should then be defined based on specific objectives and take into consideration the profile of the fleet and the different segments, as we were seeing before. Finally, last but not least, the industry is changing rapidly, and we should keep up with the trends, for instance, like electrification. So platforms like Fleet Latam are a great way to stay up to date with the latest industry trends and connect with your peers. So at last, I would like to thank you very much for your time. I will be available to exchange some ideas about fleet management and fleets in general. So in case you're interested, you can find me on LinkedIn. And I really hope you enjoy the next sessions of this Great Fleet Latam conference. Thank you very much.